I had always liked the idea of escaping the noise of the city and spending time somewhere quiet, away from phones and traffic and people constantly pressing in on you. In the summer of 2011, I rented a small cabin in the northern woods of Wisconsin. It was an old place that I had found through a listing online. Nothing fancy, just one story with a little porch, a tin roof, and a wood stove in the middle of the main room. The man who rented it out said it had no internet, no cable, and the nearest town was 20 minutes by car. That was exactly what I wanted. The drive up took almost 8 hours, and by the time I pulled into the dirt road that cut through the thick trees, the sun was already dipping low, making the shadows stretch long across the gravel. The cabin stood alone at the end of the road, with a patch of clearing around it, maybe half an acre, before the trees crowded in again. The structure looked weathered, with paint peeling around the window frames, and the front steps sagging a little in the middle. Still, it had a quiet charm, and I felt a sense of relief finally being away from everything. Inside, it smelled faintly of cedar and something older, maybe the remnants of smoke from fires long past. The floor creaked under my boots as I carried in my duffel bag and cooler. The furniture was sparse. One couch with flattened cushions, a wooden table with 2 chairs, and a bed in the single bedroom tucked against the back wall. The bathroom was barely big enough to stand in, but it had running water, and that was enough. I spent the first evening unpacking, stacking the cooler with food into the small fridge, and setting out the books I had brought along. I sat on the porch as the light faded, listening to the unfamiliar sound of the forest settling in for the night. Crickets, frogs, and the occasional rustle of leaves in the distance. Felt peaceful. That first night, though, I found it hard to sleep. The silence between the forest noises seemed heavy, pressing against the walls of the cabin. Every groan of the wood, every snap from the trees outside carried sharply in the dark. Around midnight, I thought I heard something like footsteps outside, soft and deliberate, circling the cabin. I froze in bed, staring at the ceiling, straining my ears. The sound faded after a minute, replaced by the normal night chorus, and I told myself it was probably just a deer moving through the clearing. Still, I had trouble closing my eyes again. The days passed slowly after that. I would wake early, cook eggs on the old stovetop, and spend hours walking the narrow trails that wound through the woods. The air was fresher there, filled with the scent of pine and damp earth, but I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling from that first night. Each time I returned to the cabin, I would find little things that made me second-guess myself. On the third morning, I noticed fresh scuff marks in the dirt near the steps. They weren't boot prints exactly, just patches of disturbed soil, as if someone had been walking around but trying not to leave clear tracks. I brushed it off at first, but that night, when I stepped out to take the trash to the bin behind the cabin, I had the strong sense that someone had been there before me. The lid wasn't closed all the way, and the trash bag I had tied neatly was ripped open inside. Pieces of plastic and food wrappers were scattered in the grass. Maybe a raccoon, I told myself. Maybe a bear. But I didn't like the way the bag looked torn, not shredded like animals usually do, but sliced down the side. By the 5th day, my nerves were frayed. I started noticing details that made my skin crawl. A branch outside my bedroom window was bent down as if someone had pressed on it. The screen on the porch door had a small tear near the latch that hadn't been there before. One morning, I woke up and swore the chair at the table had shifted slightly, angled just enough to make me think someone had been sitting there. I tried convincing myself I was imagining it, that being alone in the woods was playing tricks on me. But deep down, I didn't believe that. The worst was on the 7th night. I had been reading in bed with a small lamp on when I heard it again. Slow, deliberate footsteps on the porch. The boards groaned softly, too heavy for an animal. My mouth went dry, and I stayed perfectly still, my eyes locked on the shadow stretching from the bedroom doorway where the lamplight spilled. The footsteps stopped right outside the door. For For a long moment, the silence pressed down. Then there was the faint sound of metal brushing against metal, like someone testing the lock. I didn't move, barely even breathed. Whoever was outside seemed to stand there forever, but eventually, the sound faded. The porch boards creaked again, this time moving away, and then everything was quiet. I didn't sleep at all after that. The next morning, I checked the door. The lock was scratched, fresh marks where something sharp had been dragged across it. My stomach knotted. I told myself to leave, but a stubborn part of me didn't want to run. I tried to shake it off, spent the day walking farther into the woods, and came back only when the sun was setting. That was a mistake. When I pulled up to the cabin, the first thing I noticed was the door. It wasn't closed all the way, just slightly ajar, the way it would look if someone had left in a hurry. My chest tightened. I knew I had locked it before leaving. Slowly, I pushed it open. The air inside felt wrong, still and heavy, as if it hadn't been empty for long. My duffel bag on the couch was unzipped, clothes pulled out and tossed on the floor. The fridge door was hanging open, half the food gone. On the table, one of the chairs was pulled far back, angled toward the bedroom. I stepped carefully inside, my heart hammering, and checked the back room. The bed was untouched, but the closet door was open, and I knew I had left it closed. Whoever had been here had gone through everything. Panic surged, but at the same time, a cold clarity set in. Someone had been watching me all week, waiting for the right time. They hadn't taken much, not valuables, not money. Just food, clothes, and the sense of safety I had come here for. I realized then that I wasn't just being paranoid. Someone had been out there every night, circling, testing, studying. I backed out of the cabin, keeping my eyes on the tree line. The woods seemed to press closer now, shadows stretching long in the fading light. My car keys shook in my hand as I unlocked the door. I didn't bother with the cooler or the bag or anything inside. I started the engine and turned onto the dirt road, my tires spitting gravel as I sped away. In the rearview mirror, I caught one last glimpse of the cabin, standing quiet and still in the clearing. But for the first time, I noticed something else. A faint movement at the edge of the trees, a figure half hidden in the branches, standing perfectly still and watching me go. I drove until I reached the next town, not stopping until I was parked in the lit lot of a gas station, surrounded by people and the buzz of fluorescent lights. My hands were still shaking as I called the police. They took my report and a deputy agreed to check the property, but I knew deep down that whoever had been there would be long gone by the time they arrived. I never went back for my things. The man who rented the cabin sent me an email weeks later saying the place had been broken into and ransacked, and that he wouldn't be listing it anymore. I didn't answer. Even now, years later, what stays with me isn't the cabin itself, but the thought of how long I was being watched without knowing. Every step in the woods, every night I lay in that bed listening to the silence, there was someone out there just beyond the trees. And when I think about the door left open, the scratches on the lock, the figure in the shadows, I know one thing for sure. I got out just in time. The rain had already been falling for hours when I decided I couldn't take another night out in the open. My clothes clung heavy against my skin, water soaking into my socks and running down into my boots until my feet squished inside them with every step. I had been out here in the woods near the Tennessee border for almost a week, trying to clear some land I'd bought cheap the year before, but I wasn't ready for this storm. I had a tent, but it was already collapsing under the weight of water and sagging like it might give at any moment. I needed something stronger, something I could stay in without waking every hour from the wind tugging at the walls. I decided to build myself a small cabin. It didn't matter if it was rough or crooked. I just needed 4 walls, a roof, and a door that could shut out the rain. The night was setting in fast. the air dropping colder with every passing minute, and the smell of wet earth was everywhere, rising up thick from the ground like steam. My flashlight was weak, its beam cutting only a short path through the trees, but it was enough to start dragging some fallen logs toward the small clearing I'd picked earlier that week. The clearing wasn't large, maybe just enough for a cabin the size of a shed, but it felt like the only place I could set something up quickly. The soil was muddy, soft under my boots, and my breath showed in the damp air when I bent down to start trimming branches. My hands slipped on the wet wood, the sound of the rain pounding on the leaves above mixing with the steady chop of my hatchet. Every swing felt heavier as the night stretched on, and my shoulders ached with the strain, but the thought of lying in that ruined tent again pushed me forward. By the time I had enough logs to stack into a crude square, the rain had picked up even more, falling in sheets that blurred my vision. I wiped my face with my sleeve only to have it drenched again instantly. I worked by the shaky light of the flashlight propped against a rock, stacking logs unevenly, fitting them as best I could. Mud clung to everything, my boots sinking deeper every time I moved. My arms shook from exhaustion, but slowly the walls came together, rough and misshapen, leaning in places but standing. I cut smaller branches and laid them across the top, then covered them with a tarp I'd been carrying for ground cover. The wind whipped at the edges, but I weighed them down with stones, crawling on my knees to shove rocks into place while the rain poured over me. By the time I ducked inside, the tarp rattling above, my body was trembling from cold and the taste of rainwater was thick in my mouth. Inside, it was darker than the forest outside, the smell of wet wood strong and sharp. The mud tracked across the dirt floor stuck to everything, and the walls dripped slowly from the rain sliding down. Still, it was better than outside. I sat against the logs, my flashlight dim in the corner, and listened to the rain hammering the tarp like 1,000 small fists. The sound was deafening, filling the space, making it hard to think. I took off my soaked jacket, wrung it out, and laid it in the corner. My hands were raw from the work, blistered in places, and my nails were packed with dirt. My breath echoed against the walls, loud and hollow, and I realized how small the cabin felt now that I was inside it. Every gust of wind pressed against the tarp, making the branches groan. As the hours dragged, the storm only grew worse. Water pooled along the floor where the tarp sagged, dripping steady into the mud. My flashlight flickered weakly, and I felt my chest tighten with the thought of being left in complete dark. I set it down on the logs beside me and tried to rest, but every time my eyes closed, the crash of thunder rattled me awake again. Then came the sounds outside. First, I thought it was just the storm, branches snapping, leaves thrashing in the wind. But after a while, I heard it clearer, something moving through the trees. The sound of sloshing steps in the wet ground, too steady to be branches falling, too deliberate to be just rain. My whole body tensed as I pressed my ear against the wall. The steps stopped just beyond the clearing. I couldn't see anything through the cracks in the logs, only the black outlines of trees swaying in the downpour. But I could feel the presence out there, heavy and close. My hands shook as I reached for my hatchet, gripping the handle so tight it dug into my skin. I held my breath, waiting, my heart pounding against my ribs like it wanted out. Minutes passed. The rain drowned almost everything, but I swore I still heard it. Small shifts in the mud, the faint splash of water as though something circled the clearing. I kept staring at the opening I'd left for a door, my eyes burning from trying not to blink. Nothing came in. Not yet. I sat there all night, hatchet across my lap, listening. Sometimes the sound faded, swallowed by the storm, and I told myself I imagined it. Then it would come back, slow and steady, moving just enough to let me know it was real. I didn't dare sleep. By the time the first gray light crept into the sky, the storm was still going strong, but the worst of it seemed to have passed. My body was stiff from sitting, my clothes still damp and clinging, but I forced myself up. My boots squelched in the mud as I stepped to the doorway. The clearing looked torn apart by the rain, small streams cutting through the dirt, puddles wide and dark. Branches lay scattered everywhere, and my cabin leaned worse than it had the night before, the tarp sagging under the weight of water. But what caught my eye were the prints in the mud. They weren't mine. Large, deep impressions circled the cabin, trailing from one side of the clearing to the other. I bent down, running my hand through the wet soil, feeling the clear shape of a boot print. Someone had been walking around out there in the storm, circling me while I sat inside, clutching my hatchet. My chest went tight again as I followed the trail to the trees. The prints led out of the clearing and into the woods, disappearing into the tangle of soaked leaves and shadows. I stood there a long time, the rain dripping cold on my face, staring into the gray forest where the trail vanished. I had no way of knowing who it was or why they had been there. Maybe someone passing through, maybe someone watching, but they hadn't come inside, and that unsettled me more than if they had. They'd stayed out there, circling in the dark, waiting for something I couldn't understand. That morning, I packed what little I had left and left the cabin behind. The storm had ruined most of it anyway, and I couldn't shake the feeling of being followed. I kept my hatchet in my hand the whole time I walked, glancing back at the clearing until the trees swallowed it. The prints haunted me the entire hike back toward the road. The thought of someone out there in the rain, pacing around while I tried to rest, made every sound sharper, every shadow heavier. I never saw them again, but I knew they had been there. And the worst part was knowing they had chosen not to come inside when they easily could have. They had just waited. I never went back to that piece of land. I sold it off cheap the next year, losing money but gaining peace. Even now, when the rain comes hard at night and the wind presses against the windows, I remember that cabin and the prints in the mud. The memory stays sharp, like it's etched into me, because someone was there, watching, and for reasons I'll never understand, they let me walk away. I was 31 when I first stumbled across the cabin. It was the summer of 1996, and I had been driving through a rural part of northern Michigan after visiting a friend in Traverse City. My car was old, a rusted '84 Chevy truck with a gas gauge that had never worked properly. I'd miscalculated how far I could go before running out, and when the sputtering started, I knew I was in trouble. The road I was on wasn't heavily traveled, and it was pushing close to dusk. I spotted a narrow dirt track that cut off from the road and figured it was as good as any place to at least get the truck off the main stretch. The path was rough, narrow, and swallowed up by thick trees on either side. After a quarter mile of slow crawling, I saw a small clearing. That's where the cabin stood. It was weathered gray, leaning a little to one side, with a patched tin roof and a crooked porch that looked ready to collapse. The place looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. Still, it was shelter, and I thought maybe I could find a phone or something inside, though I wasn't optimistic. The woods around the cabin were silent, the kind of silence that makes you feel like you're being watched. I left the truck where it sat and walked across the clearing. The porch creaked when I stepped on it, but it held my weight. The front door wasn't locked. It dragged across the floor when I pushed it open, the sound sharp and loud in the dead air. Inside, the smell hit me first. Damp wood, old rot, and something faintly metallic like rust. The place was one room with a fireplace built from stone on one end and a broken-down cot on the other. The floorboards were warped and soft in spots, the kind where you could put your foot through if you weren't careful. Dust covered everything, but there were footprints in it. Not old ones, either. That was the first thing that put me on edge. They weren't mine, and they weren't decades old like the cabin looked. They were recent, pressed into the layer of dirt and dust that coated the floor. They led from the door toward the fireplace and back again, over and over, like someone had been pacing. I should have left right then, but my phone had no signal, and I wasn't sure how long it'd be before another car came down the road. The cabin at least gave me a place to wait until I could flag someone down. That was my reasoning, anyway. I checked around, looking for any sign of tools or maybe even a phone, though I doubted it. The place was bare except for the cot, a broken chair, and an old wood stove shoved into the corner. The stove door hung open, blackened inside from years of use. I closed it without thinking, and a puff of ash floated into the air. I sat down on the cot, but the springs groaned so loudly it startled me. The thin mattress was stained and torn, like animals had been nesting in it at some point. I stood back up, too restless to sit. Something about being in there felt wrong. That's when I noticed the back wall. The boards there didn't line up the same way as the rest of the cabin. It looked like they'd been replaced at some point, newer wood slotted into place. The nails stuck out slightly, and when I pressed my hand against one of the boards, it moved, just a little. There was space behind it. I don't know why I did it, but I pulled at the board until the nail squealed and it gave way. Behind it was a narrow gap, like a crawl space between the wall and the outside. The smell was worse there, stronger, like something had died and rotted. I shined my small flashlight inside, and that's when my stomach dropped. There were clothes stuffed in there. Old jeans, a flannel shirt, a muddy pair of boots. All balled up, shoved into the space like someone had wanted them hidden. The boots were caked with dried mud, but darker stains marked the leather too, almost black. I didn't need to touch them to know what it looked like. That was enough. I shoved the board back and stepped away, heart thudding in my chest. I told myself it could have been anything, old hunting gear, maybe, but I didn't believe it. Something about the way it was hidden, stuffed into the wall like that, told me it wasn't innocent. I decided to wait outside until daylight, where at least I could see. But when I turned for the door, I noticed something else I hadn't seen before. A rope, thin and frayed, tied around the inside door handle and looped through a hook on the wall, like someone wanted to keep it shut from the inside. That's when the dread set in. Whoever had been here before me had tied that door shut. Not to keep people out, but maybe to keep something in. I pushed it open anyway and stepped out onto the porch. The sky had gone dim, the clearing darker than I realized, the trees swallowing what little light was left. The truck sat just where I left it, and for a moment I felt relief. I hurried back toward it, but that's when I heard it. A branch snapped in the woods. It wasn't the sound of an animal. It was heavy, deliberate. I froze, listening hard. Another snap, closer this time. I strained my eyes, trying to make out shapes in the trees, but all I saw was blackness. I climbed into the truck, slammed the door, and turned the key. The engine coughed, sputtered, and died. I tried again, pumping the gas, praying it would turn over. Nothing. My hands shook as I twisted the key again and again, but the truck was dead. Something moved at the edge of the clearing. I didn't see it clearly, just the faint shift of a shadow between the trees. I locked the doors and sank down low in the seat, heart hammering so loud I thought it would give me away. I sat like that for what felt like hours, barely breathing, the woods silent except for the occasional rustle. When the night fully settled, I couldn't see the cabin anymore, just the faint outline of the clearing under the moonlight. I didn't sleep, didn't move, just waited, gripping the steering wheel so tight my hands went numb. By morning, when the first light bled through the trees, I dared to look up. The clearing was empty. No movement, no tracks that I could see from the window. My truck still wouldn't start, so I gathered my things and started walking back toward the road. Every step, I expected to hear footsteps behind me, but the woods stayed silent. It took me nearly 2 hours before I reached the main road. Not long after, A farmer in a beat-up Ford stopped and gave me a ride to the nearest gas station. I didn't tell him about the cabin. I didn't tell anyone. I don't know what I stumbled onto that night, but I know I was being watched. Those footprints in the dust, the clothes hidden in the wall, the rope on the door, the sound in the woods, they weren't coincidences. Someone had been living there, and I'd walked straight into their space. I've never been back to that part of Michigan since. Even now, almost 30 years later, I can still smell that mix of damp wood and metal, still hear the boards creak under my feet. I don't know what would have happened if the truck had started, or if I hadn't noticed the wall, or if whoever was out there had decided to come closer. All I know is that I made it out, and sometimes that's the only ending you get. I still remember the trip I took to the north of England in 2014. I was 30 years old at the time, tired from my work in London and desperate to get away from the constant noise of traffic, sirens, and crowds. A friend of mine had told me about a small cabin that could be rented on the edge of Northumberland, not far from the border with Scotland. It was meant to be a quiet escape, surrounded by woods, fields, and long empty stretches of road. I booked it for a week in late October, when the days grew shorter and the air stayed damp. I wanted time to myself, no phone calls, no emails, just silence. The drive took me most of the day. By the time I reached the cabin, a drizzle had started, the kind of steady, cold rain that never fully stops in the countryside. The cabin itself sat in a clearing, about half a mile from the nearest road. The driveway was nothing more than a dirt track, lined with wet leaves that clung to the tires. The building was plain, made of dark wood, with one window in front and a small porch. There were no other houses in sight. Beyond the clearing, the trees closed in, tall and thin, their bare branches rattling in the wind. Inside, the cabin was basic but warm. There was a fireplace, a small kitchen with old appliances, a single bedroom, and a bathroom that smelled faintly of mildew. I unpacked quickly and lit a fire. For the first time in months, I felt calm. That night, I slept hard, listening to the wind move through the trees and the occasional creak of the wooden walls. The first 2 days passed quietly. I read books, cooked simple meals, and walked along the muddy paths that cut through the woods. I saw deer in the distance, rabbits darting across the undergrowth, and once, the shadow of a fox. I hardly saw another person. That isolation was exactly what I wanted, but it also began to settle in my stomach like a weight. Each time I returned to the cabin in the evening, I felt both relief and unease, as if I was closing myself off from the world completely. On the third night, something changed. I had spent the afternoon walking further than usual, following a trail that curved downhill toward a stream. The rain had stopped, but the ground was soft and slick. By the time I returned to the cabin, my boots were covered in mud. I set them by the door and went inside. After dinner, I sat by the fire until the logs burned low. Around 10, I turned off the lights and went to bed. Somewhere in the middle of the night, I woke up. It wasn't a noise that woke me, at least not one I could name. It was more like a shift in the air, the sensation that something was different. I sat up in bed and listened. The cabin was quiet, only the faint sound of wind moving outside. I told myself it was nothing, but I couldn't shake the feeling. I lay back down, eyes open in the dark. It was then I noticed the faint shape in the window across the room. At first I thought it was just the reflection of a tree or a trick of the light. But as my eyes adjusted, I saw that it was a person, a woman. She was standing outside, pressed close to the glass, looking in. Her face was pale, her hair dark and stringy, hanging down across her cheeks. She wasn't moving, not even when I shifted in bed. She just stood there, watching. I froze. My chest tightened, and I could hear my own heartbeat thumping in my ears. I didn't move for what felt like minutes. I wanted to believe it wasn't real, that maybe I was half dreaming. But she was there, clear as day, her eyes fixed on me through the glass. Finally, I forced myself to get up. I grabbed the torch I kept on the nightstand and flicked it on. The beam of light cut across the room and shone directly at the window. But the glass reflected it back, and when I blinked against the glare, she was gone. The window was empty, just black trees beyond it. I stood there for a long time, holding the torch with a shaking hand. I couldn't convince myself it had been nothing. Someone had been there. I checked the lock on the door twice, then sat in the chair by the fireplace until morning. I didn't sleep at all. The next day, I tried to push it out of my mind. Maybe it had been a trick of the shadows, or maybe I'd seen my own reflection. Still, when I stepped outside, I walked to the window and looked down at the ground beneath it. The earth was soft from the rain, and there, in the mud, were footprints. They were small, narrow, clearly made by bare feet. They led from the trees to the window and back again. My stomach turned. I spent the day restless, unable to relax. I kept glancing at the tree-line, half expecting to see her standing there. I told myself I would leave the next morning, cut the trip short. But when night fell, I was still in that cabin. That second night was worse. I tried to stay awake by reading, but sometime after midnight, I dozed off in the chair. A sound woke me, a faint tapping, like fingers against wood. I froze, straining to hear. The tapping came again, steady and slow. It was coming from the window. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't stop myself. I turned my head, and there she was again. The same pale face, the same stringy hair. Her hand was raised, tapping on the glass. She didn't smile, didn't frown, didn't blink. Just tapped, over and over, while her eyes stayed locked on mine. I bolted upright and grabbed the poker from the fireplace. My hand was slick with sweat. I moved toward the door, not sure if I was going to run out or confront her. But when I yanked the door open and shined the torch outside, the clearing was empty. The window was bare. The tapping had stopped. I stood in the cold air, shaking. My breath came out in clouds. I circled the cabin, shining the torch into the trees. Nothing. But when I came back around to the front, the footprints were there again, fresh in the mud. I didn't sleep that night either. I sat with my back against the wall, poker in my hand, waiting for dawn. As soon as the sun rose, I packed my bag and loaded the car. My week in the cabin was over. The drive back to London felt endless. I kept checking the mirrors, half expecting to see her face in the back seat. By the time I reached the city, the whole thing already felt unreal, like a fever dream. But I know what I saw. I know she was there. A month later, out of curiosity, I searched online for anything about that area. Buried in old local news articles, I found a story from 2009. A woman in her 40s had gone missing near the woods, not far from where the cabin stood. Her car had been found abandoned by the road. The search went on for weeks, but no trace of her was ever discovered. I closed the laptop and never looked again. I never went back to that cabin, never went near that part of England again. But sometimes, when I wake up at night in my flat, I catch myself staring at the window. I half expect to see her there, standing in the dark, watching. And the worst part is, I still remember the look in her eyes. Not wild, not angry, not lost, just fixed, as if she'd already chosen me. I hadn't driven this road in years, not since the divorce. It ran along the edges of a forest, winding between tall pines and damp fields that always seemed to hold fog low to the ground. My ex-wife's cabin sat at the end of a gravel turnoff that shot away from the main road. I used to take that turn so many times, back when things were still good between us. Back when weekends meant firewood stacked by the door, coffee brewing slow on the counter, and the smell of damp leaves blowing through the windows. But that was more than a decade ago. Now it was just another stretch of forgotten countryside, the kind of place that seemed to rot quietly without anyone around to care. It was late autumn, early November of 2013. I was 43 at the time, and I had been on the road all afternoon. I was heading back toward a rental place in town after finishing a job in the next county. The light was going fast, that muddy kind of gray light you get before the sun is truly down. Rain had been on and off all day, leaving the pavement slick and the shoulders heavy with mud. I wasn't planning to stop anywhere near the cabin, but as the road curved, my headlights swept across the old gravel turnoff. Just like that, all the years came back. My chest tightened the way it always did when I thought about that place. The mailbox was still there, dented and leaning, the numbers half peeled away. Nobody had used it in years, but the outline of her last name was still faint on the side. I slowed down before I even realized I was doing it. My truck rolled a few feet past before I stopped completely. I sat there, the engine idling, wipers squeaking across the glass. Part of me wanted to keep going, but something heavier pulled me back. I put the truck in reverse and backed up until I was level with the turnoff. Then I pulled in. The gravel crunched under the tires. The drive was overgrown, wet branches hanging low, thorn vines creeping out from the edges. I hadn't seen it in so long, but I remembered every bend in the drive, every rise and dip. The forest on either side pressed close. I felt like I was cutting into a place I didn't belong anymore. I should have turned around, but I kept going. When I finally broke through the trees, the cabin sat there just like it always had, only older, darker, like it had been shrinking into itself over the years. The porch sagged. The windows were dirty or broken. The metal roof had streaks of rust running down. No cars. No signs of life. The grass around it had grown waist-high in spots, flattened only where deer or other animals had passed through. I pulled up slow, headlights washing over the place, and put the truck in park. I sat there a while, staring at the front door. I remembered nights sitting out there drinking beers with her, listening to crickets, watching the stars. It didn't look like the same place now. It looked like something hollowed out. My gut told me not to get out, but I opened the door anyway. The air was colder than I expected. Damp. I could smell the rot from the porch before I even stepped onto it. Each board groaned under my weight, soft and spongy. I pushed the door. It swung inward without a sound. I hadn't expected it to be unlocked, but it was. The smell hit me right away. Mold, wet wood, mouse droppings. It was dark inside, the last bit of daylight just enough to lay shadows across the floor. I stepped in slow. My boots left faint marks in the dust. The furniture was still there. Same couch, same table. Only everything was covered in grime, like time had chewed it all up. I ran my hand across the counter, and the dust stuck to my palm. The old rug in the living room was curled up at the corners, stiff with damp. A few beer bottles sat on the table, long emptied, labels curling. I hadn't left them there. Maybe she had, maybe someone else came through after. Hard to tell. Every corner of that cabin held a memory I didn't want to think about, but my eyes kept pulling toward them. The kitchen sink where she used to leave her coffee mugs. The wood stove that took forever to get going. The back hallway where our dog once slept before she took him with her. I should have left, but I moved further in. I wanted to see if the bedroom looked the same. The door was shut. I reached for the handle and paused. My heart was going faster now, for no reason I could name. When I opened it, the smell was worse. The roof must have leaked because the ceiling was stained, sagging. The mattress was black with mold. Clothes were piled in the corner, shredded by animals. A raccoon had probably nested there at some point. I backed out and shut the door quick. I don't know why I kept wandering, but I did. Maybe I was testing myself, seeing if I could face the place after all those years. I walked to the back, where the storage room was. The door was cracked open, and that's when I froze. There was movement inside. Not big, just enough. I held still, listening. A faint scrape, then silence. I told myself it was an animal, a raccoon, maybe a stray cat. But the longer I listened, the more it didn't sound like that. It was slow, deliberate. My skin prickled. I backed away, step by step, until my boots touched the soft boards of the porch. My heart was hammering. I didn't want to run, not yet, but every part of me screamed to get out. I moved off the porch and down into the tall grass, keeping my eyes on the door. That's when I saw the back window. A shape was standing there just inside, still as stone. Too tall to be an animal. My throat went dry. I blinked, and it was gone. I didn't wait another second. I went straight to the truck, slammed the door, and started the engine. Gravel sprayed as I turned the wheel hard and shot back down the drive. Branches scraped the sides of the truck, but I didn't care. I didn't look in the mirror. I didn't want to see anything following. When I hit the main road, I drove faster than I should have on wet pavement. My hands shook on the wheel. My chest felt tight, like I couldn't get enough air. I drove until the cabin was miles behind me, until the trees thinned and the streetlights of town started showing ahead. Only then did I slow down, but I couldn't shake the image of that shape by the window. I never went back to that cabin again. I never told anyone about that night either. What was I supposed to say? That I went snooping around a place I didn't belong anymore, and something was there that shouldn't have been? Whoever was in there, whatever reason they had for staying in that place, it didn't matter. The cabin wasn't mine. It hadn't been mine in years. What I knew was simple. I had stepped back into a piece of my past, and I had no business being there. The memories were enough. The place was dead to me long before I pulled into that drive. Seeing someone else in there, living among the rot and ruin, drove it home. The life I used to have with her was long gone. All that was left was an empty shell, dangerous if I lingered too long. That night, lying in bed in the rental place, I promised myself one thing. I would never take that road again. I was 34 when I decided to rent a cabin in northern Minnesota for a week. It was the summer of 2017, and I had been working long hours in a warehouse job outside of St. Paul. My body was tired, my head was tired, and I wanted a break from the sound of forklifts beeping and heavy doors slamming all day. The cabin wasn't fancy, just a small wooden place with 2 rooms, a kitchen area, and a screened porch that looked over a narrow dirt road. It sat tucked back in the woods, about 3 miles from the nearest paved highway. The man who rented it to me barely said a word when I picked up the keys. He gave me a handwritten note with simple directions, said the power sometimes flickered during storms, and told me to keep the door locked at night. I drove out there in my old Ford Ranger, windows down, the air hot and damp. The road got smaller the farther I went, pavement turning to gravel, then gravel giving way to a 2-track path. I remember passing a rusted mailbox that leaned sideways, paint gone, the numbers scratched off. The cabin showed itself after I followed the narrow track a little longer. A plain structure sitting on a patch of dirt cleared from the trees. It looked like it had been standing there for decades. The siding was gray from weather. The roof had moss clinging to the edges, and the wooden steps to the porch creaked when I set my weight on them. Inside, the air smelled of old wood and something faintly sour, like damp leaves left too long in a pile. There was a small table, 2 chairs, a thin rug, and a single bed with a sagging mattress. The kitchen had a propane stove and a half-sized refrigerator that hummed louder than it should. Everything felt simple but worn, like it had been left just functional enough for short stays. I put my cooler on the counter, unpacked a bag of clothes, and sat down on the porch with a beer while my dog stretched his legs. My dog, Rex, was a black and tan shepherd mix, 4 years old, full of energy. He ran the dirt clearing, nose to the ground, tail swinging back and forth. He'd stop, stare at the tree line, then run back to me before tearing off again. I wasn't nervous at that point. The forest around the cabin seemed quiet, thick with green but still, almost heavy. No houses nearby, no traffic sounds, no hum of town life. Felt cut off, and for that first afternoon, I liked it. By nightfall, the air turned cooler. I grilled a couple of hot dogs outside on a small metal grate someone had left by the fire ring. The woods grew darker than I expected, swallowing the last bit of light almost instantly after the sun dropped. Without any streetlights or neighbors, the blackness pressed against the cabin like a wall. I left the porch light on, a dull yellow glow that barely reached the edge of the clearing. Rex lay on the rug, ears twitching at every sound. The quiet wasn't peaceful anymore. It was the kind that made every small noise carry further, sharper. I heard branches crack in the woods more than once. At first I told myself it was deer, but Rex lifted his head each time, body stiff, eyes locked toward the trees. I slept poorly that first night. The mattress dipped, the springs pushed at my back, and the hum of the little fridge sounded louder in the silence. At one point, sometime past midnight, I woke to Rex growling low. He stood at the window, tail stiff, staring into the black outside. I got up, heart pounding, but when I looked out, I saw nothing. The porch light cast a circle, and past it there was only thick darkness. I stayed there longer than I should have, eyes straining, ears searching. When nothing moved, I pulled Rex back and tried to sleep again. The next day, I hiked a few miles down the dirt road, hoping to burn energy and shake the unease. The woods felt endless, heavy with mosquitoes and the smell of wet earth. I didn't see another person, not even a car. When I came back to the cabin, I noticed fresh tracks in the dirt clearing. Not animal tracks. These were heavy boot prints, deep enough that they hadn't been there the day before. They led up to the porch steps, then stopped. My chest tightened as I bent to look closer. The prints turned slightly at the base of the stairs, like someone had stood there, looking at the door before walking back the way they came. I followed them a short way into the trees, but they vanished in the thick underbrush. That night, I locked the door, checked it 3 times, and left the porch light burning. I ate little, too focused on the sounds outside. Every few minutes I swore I heard something moving in the woods. Sometimes a step, sometimes just the brush of leaves. Rex stood alert near the window again, teeth bared but silent. At one point, a sharp thud hit the porch, quick and solid, like a footstep too close. My throat went dry, and I sat frozen in the chair, waiting for the follow-up. It never came. When I finally got the courage to peek outside, the porch was empty. By the 3rd day, I wanted to leave, but pride held me there. I told myself it was just my nerves, that cabins in the middle of nowhere always felt strange at night. I tried to busy myself by fishing in a small creek nearby, reading old magazines left on the table, and keeping Rex close. Still, that evening, when I walked around the side of the cabin, I saw something that chilled me worse than anything before. Under one of the windows, faint in the dirt, were smudges where someone's hands had pressed against the siding. Finger marks. They were high enough up that whoever it was had been standing on their toes, peering in. That night, the quiet broke completely. Around 2 in the morning, Rex leapt from the rug and started barking furiously at the door. I jumped up, heart slamming, and grabbed the small flashlight I kept by the bed. The barking was so violent I had to grab his collar to keep him from clawing at the wood. Then I heard it, slow, deliberate steps moving across the porch. Not an animal. Too heavy, too controlled. The doorknob rattled once, sharp and quick, then stopped. I didn't breathe. The flashlight beam shook in my hand, pointed at the door like it was going to protect me. Rex snarled, pulling against my grip, his whole body a knot of muscle. Whoever was out there didn't try again. The steps creaked once more, then faded. I stood there for what felt like hours, back against the wall, waiting for the sound to return. It never did. When the sky finally lightened, I didn't waste time. I packed my bag, shoved everything into the truck, and called Rex into the cab. My hands shook as I turned the key. As I pulled away, I looked back once. The cabin sat quiet, still, like nothing had happened. But at the edge of the clearing, near where the dirt track met the woods, I saw it boot prints again. Fresh ones, deep in the damp soil, pointing straight at the cabin. I drove until I hit pavement, then kept going until I reached a gas station. I sat there in the lot for an hour, just breathing, trying to slow my pulse. I didn't report it. I didn't go back for the rest of the week. I left the key on the counter and mailed the owner a note saying I left early. To this day, I don't know who was out there or what they wanted. All I know is someone had been watching, waiting, and they knew I was alone in that cabin. I never rented in the woods again. I had been in the Amazon for weeks, moving deeper than most tourists or even researchers would bother to go. I wasn't there for work exactly. After leaving my job back in 2016, I had taken up traveling alone with my dog, a large shepherd mix I trusted more than any piece of gear I carried. The river had always fascinated me, but I didn't expect the weight of the silence out here, the thick air that clung to my lungs, and the endless feeling of being swallowed by green. Everything in that jungle had a sound. The dripping leaves, the buzzing insects, the faint croak of something hidden in the mud. But at times it felt so heavy and quiet I could hear my own heart. I had been walking all morning along a narrow, muddy trail carved between roots and rotting leaves when I spotted it. A structure barely visible between the trees. At first it looked like a heap of wood collapsing into itself, but as I got closer, I saw the frame of a cabin. It was raised slightly on stilts, probably to keep out the flooding during the rains. The boards were dark, swollen with moisture, the roof sagging in the middle. From the outside, it looked abandoned, forgotten, maybe even half devoured by the forest. The dog's ears pinned back as we stood there. He gave a low growl, one of those sounds he made only when something truly unsettled him. I had learned to trust that. Still, curiosity pushed me toward the steps. It wasn't every day you found a cabin this far inside. I thought maybe it had been used by hunters or loggers years ago. The front door was crooked on its hinges, leaning in like a drunk about to collapse. I pressed my hand against it, and it creaked open with a sound that made the back of my neck tighten. Inside it smelled of rot, damp wood, and something sour that I couldn't place at first. Light filtered in through cracks in the boards, long slashes across the walls and floor. I stepped in carefully, the dog staying low, his body tense. The floor groaned under my boots. There were old items scattered around. Rusted cooking pots, a torn canvas sack, an overturned chair. I saw marks on the wall too, scratches in the wood, though I couldn't tell if they were from tools, animals, or people. The air was thick and hot, but beneath that heat there was another smell. Strong, sweet and rotten, clung to the back of my throat. I didn't want to admit what it smelled like. Not yet. I walked further, my eyes adjusting to the dimness. In the far corner, the floor dipped downward slightly, and there was something covered with an old sheet of plastic. My dog growled again, stepping back. I felt my skin tighten. I knew. Deep down, I already knew. I pulled the edge of the plastic back, and that smell hit me full force. I gagged before I could even focus my eyes. Underneath lay a human body, curled awkwardly, the skin darkened and pulled tight from decay. The clothes were ragged, but I could see a shirt and pants still clinging to it. The face was barely a face anymore, just a hollow mess where insects had already done their work. I stumbled back, pulling my shirt over my nose. For a moment I couldn't move. My stomach turned. My body wanted to run, but I just stood there staring. The jungle outside roared louder in my ears, though I couldn't tell if it was real or just my pulse hammering. I forced myself to look again. The body was old, not fresh, maybe weeks or even months. Couldn't tell. I saw bones in the fingers, skin dried like paper. I knew I should leave, get back to the trail, but something kept me there. Curiosity again. I checked the rest of the cabin. In one corner there was a pack half-eaten by mold. Inside were notebooks, damp and smudged, the ink bleeding across the pages. Most of the words were unreadable, but I could make out dates. The last entry I could half read was from 2014, 2 years before. The page was torn halfway, but the handwriting was sharp, fast, uneven, like it had been written in panic. My dog whined, circling near the door. He didn't want to be inside anymore, and honestly neither did I. But I forced myself to look one more time at the body. I noticed rope marks around the wrists, dark grooves pressed deep into the bone and dried flesh. The hands were behind the back. Whoever this person was, they hadn't just died out here, they had been tied, maybe left to die. That was when the fear fully hit me. This wasn't some accident, some unlucky explorer who starved or got lost. Someone had done this to him. And if someone had tied a man up and left him here to rot, then someone else had been in this jungle with intentions far worse than mine. I felt every muscle in my body tighten, like I was suddenly a target just by standing there. I left fast. I didn't run at first, but my steps were quick and sharp, my eyes darting to every movement in the trees. My dog stayed at my side, ears pricked, tail stiff. We followed the same trail I'd come from, but it didn't feel the same anymore. Every sound seemed like it came from someone following me. The crack of a branch, the faint splash of water somewhere off the path, the hum of insects louder than before. I thought about the man in that cabin, how he had been tied, how no one had found him until now. I thought about what it meant for me to stumble across him. Maybe whoever had left him there was gone, long gone, maybe years ago. But I couldn't shake the thought that maybe they weren't. Maybe they still used that cabin. Maybe they could be out there right now, watching me from behind the walls of green. I walked for hours, pushing through roots, slipping in mud, cutting through vines that clawed at my arms. I didn't stop until the light started fading and the air grew heavier with evening. I finally found a clearing by the river and set up a small camp. But I didn't sleep. I sat there all night, my dog curled against me, listening for anything. When dawn came, I knew what I had to do. I marked the trail on my GPS and headed back toward the last outpost I had passed days before. It was a ranger station, nothing big, but I knew they had radios. It took me almost 2 days to reach it, but when I did, I reported exactly what I found. They listened carefully, took my notes, and told me they would send a team. Weeks later, long after I had left the region, I received word through an email. The rangers had found the cabin. They confirmed the body. They couldn't identify him. Not enough left to make it clear, but they believed it was someone who had gone missing years back, maybe a logger or someone caught up in conflicts deeper inside the forest. They told me the marks on his wrists showed he had been restrained, and from the condition, they suspected foul play. That knowledge stuck with me heavier than anything else. It wasn't an accident. Someone had tied that man up and left him, and I had stood in the same place, breathing the same thick air, maybe even touching the same boards as whoever had done it. I still think about that cabin sometimes, especially at night when everything is quiet and my mind drifts back. The jungle holds its secrets well, but some things, once you see them, you can never put out of your head. I remember the first time I saw the cabin. It was in the fall of 1997, tucked deep in the pines of northern Montana, far enough from the highway that the sound of cars disappeared completely. I had driven up in my old Ford Bronco, the kind of vehicle that always smelled faintly of gasoline and cold air. I was 35 back then, restless, and looking for a place to be alone for a while. A friend had told me about the cabin, said it hadn't been used much in years. It belonged to some distant relative of his, but no one cared if I stayed in it. I liked that kind of arrangement, no paperwork, no questions. The drive had taken me longer than I thought. The dirt road twisted endlessly, narrowing the farther I went, and the trees seemed to swallow me whole. When I finally parked, it was already late afternoon. The cabin looked smaller than I expected, almost hidden behind the thicket of trees. The roof sagged a little, and the porch steps creaked under my boots. It wasn't much, but it was dry, and I told myself it would do. Inside, it smelled of old wood, dust, and mice. There was a single room with a wood stove in the corner, a rough table, 2 chairs, and a narrow bed against the far wall. A lantern sat on the table, its glass cloudy. I dropped my pack down and lit the lantern. The faint yellow glow pushed back some of the shadows, but not all of them. The place felt cold in a way that wasn't just about temperature. That first night, I unpacked my sleeping bag and spread it over the thin mattress. The silence pressed on me. In the city, you always hear something, a car alarm, a neighbor's TV, a siren. Out there, all I heard was the occasional groan of the trees shifting in the wind, and once in a while, the sharp crack of a branch snapping somewhere in the dark. I tried to read, but my eyes kept drifting to the black windows. The next morning, I walked the woods to get my bearings. The trees grew thick and close together, and the ground was soft with needles. I carried a small axe and gathered some wood for the stove. I noticed the ground dipped down behind the cabin into a shallow ravine, where a thin stream ran. It was the only sound of moving water I heard, and it gave me some comfort. For the first 2 days, nothing happened. I spent my time cutting wood, hiking short distances, cooking simple meals on the stove. I told myself I liked the solitude, but by the 3rd night, I started noticing things I couldn't explain away so easily. It began with sounds, at first just small ones like faint crunching outside the cabin at night. I thought it might be deer, maybe a raccoon nosing around. But then the sounds grew louder, heavier, more deliberate. I would sit on the bed, holding still, listening to the steps move across the porch, slow and dragging. When I opened the door in the morning, I saw nothing, just pine needles scattered across the boards. No tracks. The feeling that someone was watching me grew stronger each day. I would be chopping wood and suddenly feel like I should turn around. Sure, someone was standing just beyond the tree line. I never saw anyone, but I couldn't shake it. One afternoon, I walked farther than usual, following the stream down the ravine. The air was cooler there, damp. After about an hour, I came across something that stopped me cold. It was another cabin, smaller than mine, almost collapsed from rot. The roof had caved in, and moss grew thick across the walls. I stepped closer and peered inside through the broken doorframe. There was nothing but a few broken boards and what looked like an old rusted stove. But on the ground outside, I saw something that didn't belong to time or weather. A boot print, fresh. The soil was soft, and the edges were sharp. Someone had been there recently. I walked back faster than I meant to, my pulse rising. By the time I reached my cabin, the sun was already low. I locked the door that night, though the lock was nothing more than a thin piece of metal. I sat by the stove, listening. The woods were quiet, almost too quiet. Sometime in the night, I woke to the sound of the door rattling. It wasn't the wind. I held still in the bed, my heart pounding so loud I thought it might shake the walls. The rattle came again, firmer, followed by the groan of the porch boards. I grabbed the axe I kept by the stove and waited, staring at the door. After a while, the sound stopped. I sat awake until dawn, the axe heavy in my hands. The next day, I found something wedged under the porch steps. A small piece of wood, carved roughly, almost like a totem. It was nothing more than a stick with a crude notch cut through the middle, but it didn't feel accidental. Someone had put it there. I kicked it into the brush and told myself to stay calm, but deep down, I knew this was no accident. That evening, I tried to stay busy, chopping more wood than I needed, building the fire higher than usual. But once darkness fell, the unease returned. I didn't light the lantern, hoping whoever was outside wouldn't know if I was awake. Hours crawled by in silence. Then came the soft scrape along the wall, slow and deliberate. I froze. It moved from one side of the cabin to the other, as if someone was dragging a hand across the boards. I stayed like that until the fire burned low. When morning came, I checked the walls. No marks, no sign of anything. By the fifth day, I'd had enough. I packed my bag and loaded it into the Bronco. But when I turned the key, the engine only coughed and died. I tried again and again until the battery started to weaken. The vehicle had run fine the whole trip up, and I'd filled the tank before leaving town. I opened the hood but saw nothing I could fix. Felt wrong, like it wasn't chance. I decided I'd hike back to the highway about 12 miles and try to flag someone down. I set off with my pack, but after only 2 miles, I had the feeling I wasn't alone. I kept hearing faint footsteps behind me. When I stopped, the sound stopped too. At one point, I thought I saw a figure move between the trees, but when I looked again, there was nothing. I turned back, thinking maybe I could last one more night in the cabin and try again in the morning. The moment I reached the clearing, I saw something on the porch, another carving, this one taller, sharpened at the end like a stake. It was standing upright against the door frame, waiting for me. That night, I didn't sleep. I kept the axe in my hands and sat with my back against the wall. Every creak, every shift of wind made me tighten my grip. Around midnight, I heard the steps again, slow, circling, then silence. When dawn finally came, I didn't wait. I grabbed what I could carry, left the Bronco behind, and started walking. I didn't care if it took all day. By late afternoon, I reached the highway, exhausted and shaking. A trucker finally stopped and gave me a ride back into town. I never went back for the Bronco, never saw that cabin again. To this day, I don't know who was out there or why they wanted me gone, but I know it wasn't just my imagination. Someone had been watching me, walking around that cabin at night, leaving those carvings, waiting. And if I had stayed one more night, I don't think I would have made it out. I still remember the night as if it happened yesterday, even though it's been years now. It was the autumn of 2013, somewhere deep in northern Minnesota, where the air carried the smell of pine, damp soil, and wood smoke. I was 32 at the time, not yet used to spending long stretches alone in remote places, but I had taken a week off from my job just to get away from the noise of town. I drove up with my dog, Rusty, a big German Shepherd mix I'd raised since he was a pup. He was the kind of dog who never left my side and slept lighter than I ever could. He was the reason I never felt unsafe, even out in the middle of nowhere. The cabin itself was nothing special. It was a small one-room place with rough wooden walls that hadn't seen paint in decades. It sat near a dirt trail about half a mile from the nearest gravel road, tucked in thick trees with a view of a lake down the slope. The windows were old, the kind with warped glass, and the front door had a lock that felt like it could give way if someone leaned too hard on it. The roof sagged slightly in the middle, but it kept out the rain well enough. I had brought in groceries, a small propane heater, and just enough supplies to stay put for the week. The first 2 days were quiet. I hiked around the woods, took Rusty down to the lake, and cut up some firewood with the dull axe leaning against the porch. The days were short, the sun dropping early, leaving long cold nights where the only sounds were the crackle of the fire and Rusty shifting on the floor. By the third night, the silence had started to feel heavier. When you live with constant background noise, traffic, neighbors, distant music, the absence of it can make you feel like your ears are straining for something, anything, to latch onto. That third night was colder. A drizzle had come in, leaving the leaves slick and shiny under my flashlight when I walked Rusty before bed. The air had that sharp, metallic smell it gets before frost sets in. I shut the door tight and set the heater by my cot. Rusty curled up near the door like he always did. I fell asleep listening to the rain dripping from the eaves. It was sometime after midnight when I woke up to Rusty growling. At first, I thought he was dreaming, but when I sat up, I could hear how low and steady it was. His ears were pricked, his body stiff, his gaze fixed at the door. I held my breath, listening. At first, there was nothing but the tick of the heater and the faint patter of rain. Then, underneath it, I caught the sound of crunching, slow, deliberate footsteps on the wet leaves outside. My stomach knotted. There weren't supposed to be any people out here. The nearest cabin I knew of was a couple of miles up the ridge. I reached over for the flashlight on the crate I used as a nightstand and clicked it on, the beam cutting through the cabin. Rusty didn't move except for the twitch of his ears. The footsteps stopped. Then I heard something else, faint but distinct. The sound of someone exhaling, almost a sigh, right outside the wall near the door. My mouth went dry. I switched off the flashlight and sat frozen, trying to figure out what to do. I didn't own a gun back then. All I had was a hatchet, a long kitchen knife, and Rusty. I waited. Minutes passed. Rusty's growl never faded, but whoever was outside didn't move away. The silence became unbearable. Finally, I decided I couldn't just sit there. I pulled on my boots as quietly as I could, slipped the knife into my jacket pocket, and grabbed the hatchet. I pressed my ear to the door. Nothing. No breathing, no steps. I opened it fast, the cold air hitting me like a slap. My flashlight shook in my hand as I swept the beam across the clearing. Nothing. The drizzle had stopped, leaving everything wet and shining. The trees dripped quietly, their black shapes leaning in. Rusty lunged past me, barking loud enough to echo across the water. He tore toward the edge of the tree line, where the beam of my light caught something. Muddy footprints, pressed heavy into the leaves, leading out of the clearing. They were fresh, deep, and big. Too big for me. I felt every hair on my neck stand up. Someone had been standing right there, close enough to hear me breathing inside. I called Rusty back and slammed the door, dropping the bar across it. My heart was hammering so hard it made my chest ache. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. Rusty stayed up too, his ears flicking every time the cabin creaked. When morning came, I walked the perimeter of the clearing, following the footprints. They circled the cabin once, slow and deliberate, then led back toward the woods. The trail was faint beyond that, but whoever it was had been watching for a while. It made my skin crawl. The next night, I stacked furniture against the door, as if that flimsy barrier would make a difference. I kept the hatchet in my lap and tried not to blink too long. Rusty barely rested, pacing from window to window, huffing and whining. At one point, well after midnight, I heard it again. The same crunch of leaves, this time moving around the cabin, slow and steady. My pulse thudded in my ears as I kept the flashlight off, afraid of giving myself away. Rusty growled so low it was almost a vibration. Then, something tapped against the glass. Just once, a soft knock on the side window. I nearly jumped out of my skin. My instinct screamed to shine the light, to see, but some part of me knew I didn't want to lock eyes with whoever was out there. I gripped the hatchet tighter and sat perfectly still. The knock never came again. Eventually, after what felt like hours, the sounds faded. By dawn, the ground around the cabin was trampled with fresh prints. Whoever it was had walked circles around me all night. They hadn't tried to break in. They were just there, watching. That was enough for me. I packed everything in less than 10 minutes, tossed it all in the truck, and didn't even bother to sweep the cabin out. Rusty sat alert in the passenger seat, ears pinned back as I gunned the engine and tore down the dirt trail, hitting ruts hard enough to make the truck bounce. I didn't look back until we hit the paved road. When I finally made it to town, I stopped at the diner just to sit among people, to hear voices and the clatter of dishes. Rusty finally relaxed at my feet. I told no one what had happened. Who would believe me anyway? No crime, no break-in, no face to describe. Just a man circling my cabin in the dark, tapping on the glass. I never went back to that place. The thought of someone out there, waiting in the trees, still makes my stomach twist. I know people always say dogs sense things before we do, and that week proved it to me. Rusty saved me from staying longer than I should have. Looking back, the part that unsettles me most isn't the footprints, or the knock on the glass, or even the nights of waiting. It's the fact that whoever it was had all the chances in the world to do something worse, and they didn't. They just stood there, watching me from the dark, as if waiting for something I'll never understand. And I think that's what scares me most. The not knowing, the silence of the woods, and the memory of my dog growling at the door while someone breathed on the other side of it. I was 24 years old in the fall of 1998 when I took a job working for a small landscaping company in Vermont. Most of the work was mowing lawns, trimming trees, and clearing brush, but sometimes we got odd jobs that paid a little extra under the table. One of those came from a man who managed the grounds of an old church property on the edge of town. Behind the church sat a graveyard that stretched back into the woods, most of it from the late 1800s. Past the far end of the cemetery, there was a small cabin that had once been used by the caretaker decades ago, but now it was run down and barely standing. The church had asked our boss to send someone to clean up the area, cut back brush, and check the cabin to see if it was safe enough to be torn down or needed to be patched before winter. My boss knew I wasn't afraid of long hours alone, so he sent me. I was told to spend the weekend there, camp out if I needed to, and make sure the job was done. He handed me the keys to the old iron gate at the cemetery entrance and a flashlight, then drove off. The first day was nothing unusual. I parked my truck beside the church, carried my gear through the gate, and walked up the gravel path that wound between crooked headstones. Some were cracked, leaning to one side, others half sunk into the dirt. Moss grew over the engravings, and in some places the ground had settled so low that it looked like the earth itself had swallowed pieces of stone. The air was still, heavy, and damp, the kind of silence where even your own footsteps sound louder than normal. The cabin was tucked back behind a row of pines at the very end of the graveyard. It looked worse up close than I expected. Gray wood siding warped and peeling, one shutter hanging by a single rusted hinge, and the roof sagging like it had taken one too many heavy snowfalls. The door stuck when I pushed it, but after putting my shoulder into it, I got it open. The inside smelled of mildew and old wood. The floor creaked with every step, and there was an old iron bed frame in one corner with broken springs hanging loose. The windows were clouded with grime, barely letting any light in. I left my backpack in the corner and got to work clearing brush. Most of the day went by quietly. I kept glancing back at the headstones, though, because every time the wind picked up, the pine branches creaked, and I'd swear I heard something faint. Not voices, not whispers, just something in the air that made me feel watched. As evening came on, I decided to sleep in the cabin instead of hiking back through the cemetery in the dark. I didn't bring a tent anyway. I set my sleeping bag on the floor, lit a small camping lantern, and sat against the wall. The quiet of the place was different at night. It wasn't peaceful. It felt heavy, pressing in on me. Every creak of the woods sounded sharper. Every gust of wind through the trees seemed too close, like it was sneaking in under the cracks of the cabin walls. Around midnight, I woke up suddenly. I didn't remember dreaming, but something had pulled me out of sleep fast. I sat up and turned down the lantern's light, listening. The air was so still that my own breathing sounded out of place. Then I heard it, soft crunching. Footsteps, but slow, deliberate, moving outside the cabin. They circled around, stopped near the window, then faded into the direction of the graveyard. I told myself it could have been a deer, maybe even someone from town passing through, but who walks through a graveyard at midnight? I gripped the handle of my hatchet and stayed awake for hours, waiting, staring at the cracks around the window. When morning came, I stepped outside to check. The ground was soft with dew, and near the cabin window were prints in the dirt. They weren't boots like mine. They were bare feet. The toes were widespread, pressed deep into the soil, and the steps led out toward the headstones before fading in the tall grass. I worked most of the day cutting brush, but my mind kept circling back to those prints. The graveyard was quiet, but too quiet, if that makes sense. I didn't hear birds or squirrels. Even the trees stood still most of the afternoon. Around 3, I took a break and walked through the graves. Some markers leaned so far that they looked ready to topple. One of them had fresh dirt at its base, like the soil had been disturbed recently. I stood there longer than I should have, staring at it, wondering who would dig at an old grave. By the time the sun dropped, I was back in the cabin, but this time I locked the door with the old latch and slid a piece of wood under the handle. I lay on the floor with my hatchet across my chest, listening. The silence was worse now. It pressed down, like the woods were holding their breath. It must have been close to 1 in the morning when I heard it again. The footsteps were slower this time, dragging, circling the cabin twice before stopping at the back wall. Then the sound of fingernails scratching the wood. Light but steady. My stomach dropped. I held my breath, gripping the hatchet, and forced myself not to move. The scratching stopped after maybe a minute, but I couldn't bring myself to check outside. When morning came, I went around the cabin and found fresh marks carved into the siding, long and uneven, like someone had dragged their fingers across. Below the marks were more barefoot prints, darker from where the dew had soaked into them. I knew then it wasn't an animal. Someone had been watching me, someone who didn't care if I knew. I finished the work as fast as I could that day, trimming what was left and marking the cabin structure for repairs. But I had to stay one more night. My truck was too far to haul everything back in the dark. That last night was worse. I sat awake in the corner with the lantern dimmed low. My hands were sweating against the hatchet handle. Around midnight, the steps came again, but heavier this time, more like dragging feet. They stopped right at the door. I stared at the latch, heart pounding, waiting. The wood creaked like weight pressed against it, but the door held. Then came the breathing. Low, slow breaths right against the cracks in the wood, as if someone was standing there with their face almost pressed to it. I don't know how long it lasted, but finally the sound moved away, out toward the graves. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. At first light, I packed everything in a rush and headed straight back through the cemetery. As I passed the row of stones near the pine line, I froze. The grave I had noticed with the fresh dirt 2 days before looked even more disturbed now. The soil had been turned up, almost like it had been dug deeper. I didn't stop to look closer. I walked faster, then broke into a run until I reached the gate and my truck. When I got back into town, I turned in the keys and told my boss the job was done. I didn't mention the prints or the sounds or the grave. I figured he wouldn't believe me, or worse, he'd send me back to check. I never went near that cemetery again. A few weeks later, I heard the church had finally torn the cabin down. But I know in my gut that whatever had been circling me out there wasn't the cabin itself. The prints, the scratching, the breathing, they were real. Someone had been out there with me in that graveyard, night after night, watching me from the dark. And when I think about that grave with the fresh dirt, I can't shake the thought that maybe it wasn't someone passing through, but someone who'd been living out there all along, hiding between the trees and the stones, waiting for the nights to fall quiet. The cabin was small, tucked away in the trees on the edge of the park's northern boundary. I had been stationed there as part of a rotation, the kind of assignment no one really wanted but everyone had to do eventually. It was 1997, late autumn in northern Montana, and I was 29 at the time, still new enough to the Ranger Service to feel I had to prove something, but experienced enough to know when a job was just plain miserable. The Park Service used the old cabin as an overnight post for whoever was on patrol in that section. It had been built decades earlier and was never meant to be lived in long-term, just a bare-bones shelter. For walls, a roof that creaked with the wind, and a wood stove that only half worked on a good day. I remember the air that day was already heavy with the smell of wet pine. It had rained earlier, and the ground was still soft, sticking to my boots. The forest around me was thick, the kind of dense timber that makes every sound feel closer than it is. I had finished my patrol late, checking the fire lines and looking for signs of campers in restricted areas. It had been quiet, almost too quiet, and I was relieved to see the dark outline of the cabin when I got back. Inside, the place smelled of damp wood and smoke. The stove had a rusted door that didn't close properly, and the chimney whistled with the wind. I hung my jacket on the nail by the door, sat down on the rough wooden chair, and tried to dry out my socks by the stove. I had no radio contact that far out. The signal didn't reach the northern edge. The isolation was something I'd gotten used to, but it always sat in the back of my mind like a stone in my boot. If something went wrong, I was on my own. The night came fast in the forest. By 6 o'clock, the trees were black outlines, and the clouds had gathered so thick that no moonlight made it through. I lit the old lantern, its glass smudged and cracked, and the light cast shaky shadows across the cabin walls. The rain started up again, harder this time, tapping on the roof in uneven bursts. I sat there, listening to it, trying to push away the unease that always settled in on nights like that. Around 8, I heard it, a sound that didn't fit with the rain or the wind. It was sharp, deliberate, a branch snapping. My back went tight and I held still, listening. It wasn't close, but it wasn't far either. Maybe a couple 100 feet out. I tried to tell myself it was an elk moving through the brush, or maybe a bear. They were common enough, and animals breaking branches in the dark wasn't unusual. But I didn't move. My ears strained for the next sound, and it came. Another crack, closer this time. I thought about stepping outside, but the rain was coming down in sheets now, and the beam from my flashlight wouldn't have carried far in that mess. I stayed put, sitting stiff in the chair, my eyes on the door. Minutes dragged by, and the only sounds were the rain and the creak of the cabin settling in the wind. I finally convinced myself it was just my nerves playing tricks. By 10, the lantern had burned low, and I was dozing in the chair when I heard it again. Not a branch this time, a thud, solid, heavy, right against the wall of the cabin. I froze, every hair on my neck standing up. Then another thud, lower, near the floorboards. Something or someone was pressing against the cabin from outside. I stood slowly, every movement careful, and reached for the flashlight on the table. The beam cut across the room, landing on the door. I thought about calling out, but what good would that do? No one was supposed to be out here. The only road into this section had been closed for the season weeks ago. Whoever it was had come through miles of thick forest in the dark and pouring rain. The sound came again, a scrape this time, along the outer wall. Then silence. I waited, holding my breath, the flashlight tight in my hand. After a long minute, I forced myself to move toward the window. I wiped the foggy glass with my sleeve and aimed the light outside. Nothing, just the trees swaying in the storm. I didn't sleep. I stayed in the chair with the flashlight in my lap, listening to the storm batter the roof. Sometime after midnight, I heard footsteps on the porch. Slow, heavy, the boards creaking under weight. I could see the shadow through the slit at the bottom of the door, a dark shape moving across the gap. The knob rattled, soft at first, then harder. My stomach dropped. The door had only a simple latch, nothing that would hold if someone wanted in badly enough. I thought about the rifle that should have been hanging on the wall, but the last ranger stationed here had taken it back to headquarters for cleaning, and it hadn't been replaced. All I had was a hatchet I used for splitting wood, leaning in the corner. I grabbed it and held it across my lap, the metal cold and slick in my sweaty hands. The knob stopped rattling, and the footsteps moved away. I sat there for what felt like an hour, staring at the door, waiting for the next sound. Nothing came. At some point, exhaustion pulled me under, and I drifted off with the hatchet still in my lap. When I woke, it was gray outside. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, and the forest was dripping and quiet. I stood, my body stiff and sore, and went to the door. My fingers shook as I pulled the latch and stepped onto the porch. The first thing I saw were the footprints, deep impressions in the mud, right there in front of the door. They weren't boots like mine. They were bare feet, large, wide toes splayed out. Whoever had been there had stood inches from the door for a long time. The prints led down the steps, across the clearing, and vanished into the trees. I followed them only a short distance before they disappeared in the wet undergrowth. I stood there, the cold, damp air clinging to my skin, and felt a weight settle on me that I can still remember all these years later. Someone had been out there in the middle of the night, in freezing rain, barefoot, circling the cabin and testing the door. And I had sat just feet away on the other side of thin wood walls, clutching a hatchet like it would have made a difference. I never saw anyone. No reports came in, no signs of a missing person. Nothing. But I know what I saw that morning. The bare footprints stayed with me long after I left that post. To this day, whenever I think back on it, I realize the worst part wasn't that someone had come. It was that they left knowing I was inside and chose not to come back again. That was the last time I volunteered for an overnight in that cabin. Even now, years later, when the rain comes hard at night and I hear it beating on the roof, I find myself listening, waiting for the sound of heavy feet on the porch. I still remember the first time I stayed alone in that hunting cabin, and I don't think I'll ever forget what happened out there. It was the fall of 1997, late October, in northern Minnesota, about 3 miles deep into state forest land. The cabin wasn't anything fancy, just a single-room structure with a wood stove, a narrow cot, and shelves lined with old gear. My uncle had built it years back for deer season, and it had no power, no plumbing, just bare wood walls and a rusty lantern that smelled like kerosene when you lit it. I was 26 at the time, still young enough to feel invincible but old enough to know when something felt wrong. I had gone out there planning to hunt a few days, clear my head, and get away from the noise of town. The drive up was quiet. The dirt road narrowed until the trees almost brushed both sides of my truck. The air was cool, the sky gray, and the ground littered with damp leaves that clung to my boots when I stepped out. By the time I reached the small clearing where the cabin sat, the forest already felt heavy. The trees pressed close around the cabin, and even though it was only late afternoon, shadows stretched long across the clearing. I unloaded the truck, carried in my pack, and lit the lantern before darkness set in. The first night was calm. I cooked a can of stew on the stove, the smell of grease and metal filling the cabin, and listened to the woods outside. Every snap of a branch carried through the walls. Around midnight, the wind picked up, whistling faintly through cracks in the logs, and I lay awake on the cot, staring at the dark ceiling. The cabin creaked as if something leaned against it. At the time, I told myself it was just the wind. The next morning, I went out to scout. The woods were damp and cold, my breath hanging in front of me. I followed an old game trail that wound down a shallow ridge, finding tracks pressed into the mud, deer for sure, maybe even a big buck. I felt a spark of excitement then, the kind that makes you forget everything else. But by midday, clouds gathered and rain began to fall. I turned back toward the cabin, figuring I'd dry off, eat, and head back out later. That was when I noticed the first thing that unsettled me. Near the cabin, about 50 yards out, I saw footprints in the soft dirt. They weren't mine, and they weren't from boots like mine. These looked wider, heavier, with deep impressions like someone had been pacing near the cabin. At first I thought maybe a hunter had wandered close, but the tracks circled in odd patterns, not in any direction that made sense. I crouched down, touched the edge of one, and found it still damp from the rain. Whoever had made them, it hadn't been long ago. I told myself it didn't matter, that people wandered these woods all the time. Still, when I stepped back into the cabin, I bolted the door, something I usually never bothered with. The rain hammered the roof as night fell, and I sat on the cot with the lantern burning low, every so often glancing at that door. I barely slept. By the third day, I was starting to feel uneasy. I went out again at dawn, but my focus wasn't on hunting anymore. I checked the tree-line, listened for any sound that didn't belong. Midway through the morning, I saw something else. Broken branches about shoulder height, as if someone had pushed through the underbrush, not far from the cabin. The ground showed scuffed dirt, like a boot had slipped. Whoever it was, they were close. That evening, the unease turned into something sharper. After dark, I sat inside, the lantern casting a weak glow, when I heard it. Footsteps outside. Slow, heavy, crunching on wet leaves. They circled the cabin once, maybe twice, and then stopped near the back wall. I held my breath, the only sound inside the pounding of my heart. The wood creaked slightly, as if someone leaned against it. I gripped the hunting rifle beside me, not knowing if I should move or stay still. After what felt like forever, the sound faded, and the woods went quiet again. I didn't sleep at all that night. Every creak of the cabin felt like a warning. When the first light of dawn slipped through the gaps in the logs, I stepped outside. The air was cold and wet, and the ground around the cabin was torn up with prints. They led from the tree-line to the cabin, looping around it, some pressed right up against the walls. I counted at least a dozen passes. That was the moment I knew I wasn't imagining things. Someone had been out there, walking around my cabin all night. I packed my gear quick, stuffing what I could into my bag, and decided to leave that afternoon. But the forest didn't want me to leave so easily. As I carried my pack toward the truck, I noticed something strange hanging from a low branch about 20 yards from the cabin. A strip of cloth, faded red, torn and tied into a knot. I don't know why it chilled me so much, but it felt deliberate, like someone left it there to be seen. I didn't touch it. When I finally got the truck started, the sense of relief was huge, but it didn't last long. As I pulled down the narrow dirt road, I saw movement in the trees. Not close, but far enough to make me slam the brakes. Between the trunks, someone stood watching. I couldn't see their face, just a dark outline of a figure, still as stone, turned toward me. I hit the gas and didn't look back. I didn't stop until I reached the highway miles away, my hands tight on the wheel, heart hammering in my chest. That night I slept in my own bed, but I couldn't shake the thought of those footprints circling the cabin, or the figure in the woods, silent and waiting. I never went back to that cabin again. My uncle asked why I stopped hunting there, but I never told him the full story. Maybe it was a drifter, maybe someone living rough out there who didn't want me in their territory. Or maybe it was just someone messing with me, trying to scare me off. I'll never know. What I do know is that whoever it was, they wanted me to feel watched, wanted me to know they were out there. And it worked. To this day, almost 3 decades later, I can't think of that cabin without remembering the sound of those footsteps outside the thin walls, circling in the dark, waiting for me to move. I was 26 years old the year I decided to spend a week in a cabin outside Flagstaff, Arizona. It was the summer of 2017, and I had been working too much in Phoenix, barely sleeping, barely eating, just going through the motions every day. A friend of mine had told me about a small cabin up near the Coconino National Forest, tucked away on private land. It was quiet, isolated, nothing around for miles except trees, dry grass, and the occasional dirt road. That was exactly what I wanted: silence, somewhere to clear my head. The cabin itself was small, maybe 2 rooms total. One had a narrow bed, a table, and a wood stove. The other was more of a utility room with shelves, old tools, and boxes of supplies that looked like they had been sitting there for decades. The place smelled faintly of cedar mixed with something musty, like dust and damp wood. The first 2 days were easy. I hiked during the day, cooked simple meals, and read books I'd been putting off for months. The nights were quiet except for the sound of crickets and the occasional owl. On the 3rd night, things changed. Started with a noise outside, faint at first, like footsteps moving around in the dirt. First, I thought it was a deer. They're common in the area, and sometimes you can hear them moving close to cabins if they smell food. But these steps weren't consistent. They came slow, almost deliberate, stopping and starting, circling. I sat in bed with the lantern turned down, listening. After a while, it stopped, and I convinced myself it was nothing. The next morning, I walked around the cabin to check. The soil there was dry and loose, easy to leave prints in. A few yards from the front door, I saw something that didn't sit right with me. The tracks were shaped almost like human footprints, but longer, thinner, and uneven, as if whoever made them had been dragging their feet. Some were deep, like the person or whatever it was heavy. They circled around the cabin once, then trailed off into the woods. I crouched down, staring at them, trying to come up with a normal explanation. A hiker, maybe, but there was no reason for anyone to come all the way out here. The land wasn't open to the public. That day, I stayed closer to the cabin, feeling uneasy. The woods no longer seemed relaxing. Every little sound, the snap of a twig, the brush of wind against branches, made me tense up. By evening, I built a fire in the pit out front and sat near it until the sky went completely dark. When I finally went inside, I locked the door and shoved one of the old boxes in front of it. That night, the noise came again. This time, it was louder. The steps dragged slowly, circling, sometimes coming close to the walls as if whoever it was brushing against the wood. At one point, I heard something tap against the glass of the one small window beside the bed. I didn't look. I just lay still, staring at the ceiling, listening as my heart pounded so hard it made my ears ring. The footsteps went on for hours, fading, returning, until eventually, near dawn, they stopped. The next morning, I didn't want to step outside. but I forced myself to. The fire pit was scattered, as if someone had kicked dirt into it during the night. Around the cabin, the same strange tracks appeared again, only this time they were doubled, like two sets circling from different directions. I thought about leaving that day, but I tried to convince myself it was probably just someone messing around. Some local who knew about the cabin and wanted to spook me. That night was the worst. The air felt heavy even before the sun went down. I locked everything, shut the curtains, and sat at the table with a kitchen knife I found in one of the drawers. Around midnight, I heard the steps again, but this time they didn't circle. They stopped right at the door. For a long time, there was nothing but silence, and then I heard a sound that made my skin crawl. It was like a voice, but not clear, low, broken, like someone trying to copy the sound of a person speaking without fully knowing how. It wasn't words I could understand, just fragments of noise, rising and falling, almost human but off in a way I can't explain. I didn't move. I sat there gripping the knife until my hand went numb. After a while, the noise faded and the steps moved away. I didn't sleep at all. When the sun came up, I'd already decided to leave. I threw everything back into my bag, shoved it in the truck, and was about to drive off when I stopped and looked back at the cabin one last time. That's when I saw it maybe 30 yards into the trees. A figure standing just far enough that I couldn't see it clearly. It was tall, thin, and its posture was strange. Its shoulders too high, head tilted to one side like it was studying me. The thing didn't move. It just stood there, and even from that distance I felt locked in place by it. I didn't stay to get a better look. I got into the truck, slammed the doors, and drove down that dirt road faster than I should have. In the rearview mirror, for a split second, I thought I saw it step closer to the edge of the trees, but I didn't slow down to check. When I got back to Phoenix, I didn't tell anyone the full story. I said the trip was fine, that I just wanted to come home early. A few weeks later, out of curiosity, I looked into the history of that area. There were mentions, stories told quietly, never officially written down, about things people saw in those woods. Figures that looked almost human but not quite. Hunters who heard voices calling out in the dark, trying to mimic people they knew. Some called them skinwalkers, old stories passed down through generations. I don't know what I saw. I don't know what circled the cabin at night or what left those tracks. All I know is that it wasn't just an animal, and it wasn't just some person messing with me. It was something else. Something that knew how to move like us, sound like us, but wasn't us. And I haven't been back to the woods since. I grew up in cities most of my life, so spending time on a farm was never really part of who I was. I had cousins who owned land in northern Missouri, and in the fall of 1997, I drove out there for a week because I needed some space away from my own life. My job in St. Louis had burned me out, and being 33 years old, single and tired, I figured a week in an old cabin surrounded by fields and silence would clear my head. The cabin sat on the edge of my uncle's property, maybe half a mile from the main house. It was a one-room wooden place, built decades ago, with gaps in the walls that let the wind slip through at night. There was a small iron stove, a narrow bed pushed into the corner, and a warped table with 2 chairs. The place smelled faintly of old hay, rust, and wood that had soaked in rain for too many years. I could see the barn from the small front window, but beyond that was just acres of empty farmland, with patches of trees scattered here and there. The first night was fine. I cooked some canned soup on the stove, read a little by flashlight, and listened to the crickets outside. It was colder than I expected, and the stillness pressed down in a way I wasn't used to, but it wasn't bad. By the second night, though, I started to feel a kind of unease. It wasn't a clear thought, more of a weight that came when the sun went down and the cabin filled with shadows. Around midnight, lying on the bed with the thin blanket pulled up to my chin, I heard something outside. At first, I thought it was the wind or a stray dog, but the sound didn't move like either of those. It was a slow, deliberate crunch of footsteps on gravel, the kind of careful steps someone makes when they don't want to be heard. I lay still, holding my breath, counting each step. The sound circled once around the cabin and then stopped. I didn't sleep much that night. By morning, the ground outside showed faint tracks, boots pressed into the dirt. I crouched to look closer. The steps led from the edge of the field up to the cabin, went around it once, and then stopped in the grass. No trail leading back. I told myself it was probably a farmhand or some neighbor who'd wandered too far. But the prints were fresh, sharper than prints that had been left for a day. The next night, I locked the cabin door with the rusty padlock, though I doubted it would hold against anyone serious. I left the lantern unlit and sat at the table with my flashlight, pointing it at the window every few minutes. The fields outside looked like a flat sea of black, nothing but the faint shine of the moon on the barn roof. Around 1 a.m, I heard it again. Slow steps in the dirt, then silence. My skin prickled and I could feel every hair on my arms stand straight up. I waited, straining my ears, and then I heard the crunch of weight on the wooden porch. Just one step. Whoever it was didn't knock or try the handle. They just stood there. I didn't move. I kept the flashlight tight in my hand, ready to blast the beam through the window if I had to. After maybe a minute, the porch creaked again, lighter this time, like someone shifting their weight. Then nothing. By dawn, I opened the door slowly, half expecting to see someone waiting. But the porch was empty, and the only trace left was a faint boot mark near the edge of the step. I walked around the cabin, and on the far side, I found something that made my stomach twist. There were 2 cigarette butts pressed into the dirt, still smelling faintly of smoke. Whoever was out there had stood long enough to smoke twice. The days were normal enough, but nights turned into a kind of torture. I kept seeing shapes moving at the edge of the field when the sun went down. Once, I thought I saw someone crouched low near the barn, though when I blinked, the figure was gone. I barely slept. I sat with my back against the wall, flashlight in one hand, the only kitchen knife I found in the other. Every sound, every scrape, every shifting board made me tense. On the 5th night, things escalated. I had just laid down, trying to convince myself it was all in my head, when the window beside the bed rattled. Not from the wind, but like fingers drumming against the glass. I shot upright, heart pounding. The sound stopped. I flicked the flashlight toward the window, but all I saw was my own reflection and darkness beyond it. I kept the light fixed there for a long time, my throat dry, until I heard the scrape of something against the door. A slow drag like metal across wood. I froze, listening. Then it came again. I got up quietly, my knees weak, and pressed my ear to the wall. The sound stopped, followed by silence that felt endless. When morning finally came, I went out and found fresh marks on the door. Long scratches, not from an animal but from a blade or some sharp tool. Whoever it was, they were trying to get in. I thought about packing my things and leaving right then, but stubbornness or maybe pride kept me there. I told myself I'd just hold out one more night and then head back to St. Louis. That last night was the worst. I piled a chair against the door and kept the knife at my side. Around midnight, I heard heavy footsteps approaching fast across the gravel. Not slow, not careful this time. Running. They hit the porch hard, boards groaning under the weight. The door handle rattled, jerking violently against the lock. The chair pressed forward as the door shook, and I gripped the knife so hard my hand ached. I backed into the corner, flashlight shaking in my hand, ready for the door to splinter. But it didn't. After a long moment, the rattling stopped. The porch groaned again, and then silence. I stood there for hours, heart hammering, until pale light finally came through the cracks in the wall. By the time I stepped outside, my decision was made. I didn't care about pride anymore. I walked straight across the field to my truck and drove back toward the highway without even going to the main house. I didn't look back at the cabin, didn't stop for anything. I never told my uncle what happened, never mentioned the tracks or the scratches or the night the door almost gave in. All I know is someone was out there in those fields watching me, circling the cabin, testing the locks. Maybe they thought I was an easy target. Maybe they were just playing some sick game. I don't know. What I do know is that I will never set foot on that farm again. Even now, all these years later, I still wake up some nights hearing those same slow steps circling, that rattle of the handle in the dark, and I remember the feeling of being hunted with nowhere to go.